Nazi International, Part 3 by Bert Gümüş. Oktober X, İTİ Nürnberg.
Wartime and post-war Nazi collaboration with Arab states and radical Islam.
The genesis of the cooperation between militant Islam and the extreme right can be traced back to the early years of the Third Reich. During World War I, much of the Islamic world sympathized with the Axis alliance. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood would often say prayers for an Axis victory during their meetings. Moreover, some Muslims went so far as to fantasize over putative Islamic affinities of fascist leaders. For example, rumors abounded that Benito Mussolini was an Egyptian Muslim whose real name was Musa Nilil Moses of the Nile, and that Adolf Hitler too had secretly converted to Islam and bore the name Haider, or the Brave One. After the promulgation of the Nuremberg race laws in 1936, which denied German citizenship status to Jews, the Nazi Reich received telegrams of support from throughout the Muslim world. The Third Reich's interest in the Muslim world, however, would not begin until 1937 with the publication of a report by the British Royal Commission, which explicitly recommended for the first time the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. This prompted the German Foreign Ministry, which feared a Jewish state could become a base of operation for international Jewry along a similar basis as the Vatican City State, to examine ways of increasing support for the purpose of strengthening the Muslim world as a counterweight against such a possible increase in power for world Jewry. These methods included overt diplomatic overtures to more covert support for radical Islamic groups. Attention was paid to three countries in particular on the peripheries of the British Empire, strategically positioned to threaten sensitive British interests: Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan.
Iraq.
German interest in the country began long before the Nazi Party took power. Nazi interest in that country, then under strong British influence, dates back to the 1920s, when the National Socialist Party was still in its infancy. Not surprisingly, one finds the character of Detlef Schmude, a main player in the Nazi Party's secret society Becker, the infamous Thule Gesellschaft, a member as well in von Liebenfeld's Order of the New Templars ONT, and an editor of the Thule Society's magazine Ostara, settling in Tabriz, in neighboring Persia.
Emblem of the Thule Society with one circle and a rounded swastika. Flag of the Order of New Templars, Ta Naziri Counts, Ujurisa Group.
There he based his next few years. Search for the hidden masters. Someone of Schmude's importance and position within these groups suggests that he was the point man for gathering facts and information for them. Then, in 1933, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris' Abwehrabteilung, Germany's military intelligence, dispatched Dr. Paul Leverkuhn to the Middle East to cultivate allies among the Muslim populations under British rule or influence. His headquarters was also Tabriz in Persia. But most interestingly, his most highly placed recruit was none other than pro-Nazi Iraqi Prime Minister Rashid Ali, overthrown 2 years later by the British invasion of Iraq. Canaris' network of Abwehr agents inside of Iraq was taken over by Himmler in 1944 after Canaris' implication in the bomb plot against Hitler in July of that year. Strangely enough, Himmler placed these agents under the control of none other than Baron Rudolf von Sebottendorf, one of the principal founders of the Thule Gesellschaft to begin with and, like Schmoody, a member of von Liebenfeld's Order of the New Templars. This implies that the real basis of Nazi networks in Iraq was grounded in the secret society network in the region, perhaps initiated by Schmoody. What happened to this Thule SS network in Iraq after 1945, no one knows. However, it is interesting to note that von Sebottendorf's body was found floating in the Bosporus in Istanbul in 1945 after the war's end. However, it must be added that there are rumors that Sebottendorf was allegedly murdered by a secret sect from Istanbul, but the question remains open whether this really corresponds to the truth. As indicated, Nazi interest in Iraq stemmed in part from the covert and hidden occult influences at work in the secret societies that midwifed the Nazi Party into existence, influences that later extended into the upper echelons of Himmler's SS. But here it is important to note the political aspect of German involvement. For with German support, Rashid Ali staged his now famous coup. It was an act that directly threatened Britain's oil lifeline. Britain had to respond, and did so with an invasion that topped the regime. The British invasion did not, however, succeed in rolling up the Nazi espionage network, for that was based in Iran, as was seen. The Iraqi coup was aided by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who in 1939 was in Baghdad, meeting with the Committee of Free Arabs. There he discussed the plans for the coup with the group of colonels leading the committee. The Mufti was at it again in 1940 when he was in Berlin, signing an Axis Arab Manifesto of Liberation, in which both fascist dictators expressed their strong support for an independent, united Arab nation. What emerges from this is a pattern of Nazi and German support for and exploitation of Arab and Muslim aspirations against the imperialism of oil, that is to say, Britain and the United States.
Adolf Hitler talking to Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini left? The Grand Mufti and SS Commander Heinrich Himmler right.
Iran.
Iran played its own peculiar role in Nazi Muslim contacts. In Persia, a nationalist general, Shah Reza Pahlavi, who seized power in 1925, was an admirer of Adolf Hitler's racial policies and even went so far as to rename his country Iran, which translates into Aryan in Persian. During the Shah's reign, until overthrown by British and American troops in 1941, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem briefly took refuge in the country, as will be seen below.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan was another country to which Nazi Germany made serious diplomatic advances throughout the 1930s. These, as elsewhere in the Muslim world, were successful, and Germany succeeded in establishing very cordial relations with the Afghani government. So good were relations that the Nazis that they even attempted to establish a political alliance with Mullah Mirza Ali Khan, who, along with his Wazir Mujahideen, resisted British rule of the northwestern province of Afghanistan from 1937 to 1947. Nazi envoys successfully contacted Islamic guerrillas in the British zone of Sarhad, bringing with them a letter of support from Adolf Hitler. This time, however, the embassy was ambushed by the British and Afghani border police. The king, whatever his pro-Nazi sympathies might have been, was well aware of what had happened to Iraq and Iran, and decided to expel all German and Italian diplomats from his country. As has been seen, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, played a prominent role in Nazi plans for the region. Having signed the Axis Arab Manifesto of Liberation in Berlin in 1940, the Grand Mufti once again made his way back to the Middle East, first headquartering himself in Baghdad until the British coup overthrew the pro-Nazi government, forcing al-Hussein to flee to Nazi-friendly Iran, until again forced to flee by the arrival of British and American troops and the installation of a pro-Allied puppet government in Tehran. Al-Husseini made his way back to the one country and city in which he knew he would be welcome, and where he would remain until the war's end: Nazi Germany and Berlin. There, among other activities, in aid of the Nazi radical Muslim cause, he helped form the Arab League in 1944. According to researcher George Michael, the Grand Mufti has his own hands bloody in the Holocaust, for he played a significant role in discouraging the Nazi regime and the pro-Nazi governments of Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria from allowing Jewish emigration to Palestine. More importantly, al-Husseini, while still resident in Jerusalem, received a special envoy from Nazi Germany in 1937, one of whose members was Adolf Eichmann. The purpose of the special embassy to al-Husseini was to discuss the possibility of Jewish emigration to Palestine. Husseini, of course, discouraged this. As Michael also notes, there is evidence of limited cooperation between the Nazi regime and Zionists themselves in this matter. From Christopher Simpson's book, Blowback, it is known that Heydrich's RSHA and he, Gestapo, helped Fivl Polkes train Jewish guerrillas at camps inside the Reich for armed terrorist actions against the British Mandate in Palestine. The famous Jewish playwright Van Hecht also documented in his book Perfidy the case of the trial of a Jewish doctor in Israel in the 1950s for his role in rounding up Hungarian Jews and shipping them to their certain murder at Auschwitz. And there are even larger issues and little-known facts than this that lurk beneath the sporadic but murderous Nazi-Zionist cooperation, which would require an article in its own right to explore.
The First Suicide Squad and the Muslim Waffen-SS.
Among the more active material assistance the Grand Mufti gave to Hitler was his active recruitment among Bosnian Muslims for volunteer soldiers for the Muslim Waffen-SS Handschar Division. Husseini also made pro-Axis broadcasts to the Arab world from Nazi Germany and wrote a book, Islam and the Jews, a motivational treatise designed to incite Muslim hatred of Jews, and as it turned out, Orthodox Christian Serbs, and motivate Muslim volunteers to assist in the Nazi slaughter. For his efforts, the Nazi regime made him the Supreme Sheikh-ul-Islam, the Supreme Chaplain for Nazi Germany's Waffen-SS Muslim legions. If the Nazi regime's evaluation is any indicator, al-Husseini was a definite asset to the cause.
Amin al-Husseini inspects the Handschar Division on 13. January 1944. SS Handschar Troop Badge.
Indeed, in one sense, the Grand Mufti succeeded in opening the floodgates of Muslim manpower to the Axis. For as late as 1945, units of volunteer Muslims were raised from Chechnya and other regions far behind the front lines in the Soviet Union, and were organized into 19 independent Islamic combat battalions and 24 infantry companies in the Wehrmacht. Furthermore, Muslim Turks and Tatars were organized into a Waffen-SS division known as the Osttürkisches Waffenverband, East Turkish Armed League, and SS Waffengruppe Turkestan SS Armed Turkestan Group. Some of these units operated behind Soviet lines as anti-communist partisan groups, while several Muslim units participated in crushing the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Grand Mufti certainly delivered not only manpower, but experience for such activities, for he is also credited for helping to organize long before the ties. For he is also credited for helping to organize long before the war the first modern Fedayeen, suicide squads, which primarily targeted moderate Arabs who refused to support his agenda. Not surprisingly, then, the Grand Mufti appears to have figured in the Nazis' post-war calculations. Remaining in Germany until just 3 days before Hitler's suicide, the SS contacted the Mufti and offered him an airplane by which to escape from Switzerland. Al-Husseini refused, apparently preferring to make his way to the neutral country by means of a car which he had purchased for the purpose. The SS hoped that al-Husseini would eventually make his way to North Africa, where he had established spy networks that were still extant. In point of fact, the Grand Mufti did indeed eventually end up in Egypt, where he had a great influence on emerging Arab leaders, and no doubt also helped organize radical Islamic guerrilla and suicide units, for among those he influenced was his distant cousin Yasser Arafat, founder of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Additionally, there is evidence that the Mufti also was directly involved in the organization of Fatah, the PLO's militant and terrorist arm. Just how al-Husseini was able to do all this without significant financial support is a moot point, for as has been seen, Bormann's emerging Nazi International not only had money, but had lots of it.
Yasser Arafat, 1970 left. The official emblem of Fatah, right?
The fact that al-Husseini was offered direct SS assistance as the Reich collapsed, and with the mad scramble of Nazis trying to flee the country and acquire their own vehicles and airplanes already in scarce supply, is an indicator of just how highly ranked in the scheme of Nazi priorities for the post-war world he really was. Needless to say, the Mufti also helped organize rat lines for Nazis who fled to the Middle East, with significant post-war repercussions, as will be seen momentarily. Nazi participation was sought by post-war Arab leaders, was given by the Nazis themselves, and often with the quiet but very direct support of the West German government itself. Egypt's post-war leaders and their collaboration with well-known post-war Nazis is a significant case in point, and in it, one may see the outlines of the Nazi International's post-war policies and politics at work. Egypt was, in fact, the one country that perhaps was the most deeply influenced by the Nazi regime, for as Field Marshal Rommel Afrika Korps drove ever deeper and closer to Alexandria and Cairo in early 1942, Egyptian Arab sympathies for an Axis victory were often openly expressed in British-occupied Egypt. Even King Farouk was supportive of the Nazi cause in spite of his rule being propped up by the British. Even with the war's end, populist Egyptian anti-Western sentiment against Farouk's rule had grown to such an extent that both the US and British governments decided that Farouk had to be replaced. At this juncture, events once again took a very strange turn. The CIA, under the influence of John Foster Dulles, selected Egyptian General Mohammed Naguib to lead a new Egyptian government. On July 22, 1952, with the help of the CIA, Naguib sent the army into the streets of Cairo and Alexandria and established himself as the commander-in-chief of military forces. Although Naguib was the titular head of state, unbeknown to the CIA, the real power ultimately rested with Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, who soon assumed the position of president. This coup was also significant because it opened the door for numerous Nazis to take prominent positions in the Egyptian government. As is known by now, the reality of the CIA's Soviet desk at that period of history was that it was being run on a practical level, and in terms of its human on-the-ground assets in Eastern Europe, by a group of Nazis still under the command of the wartime general in charge of German military intelligence on the Easter Front, Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen secretly negotiated with American OSS station chief in Zurich, Switzerland, Alan Dulles, to turn over to the Americans his entire network so long as the network remained in the day-to-day operational control of Gehlen himself. Before President Truman's signature was even dry on the National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA, its civilian character and charter had already been severely compromised, since almost its entire operational and analytical Soviet desk, as mentioned above, was staffed by a bunch of former Nazis. The value of Gehlen's intelligence regarding foreign attitudes and intentions toward the USA was often specious at best. For Gehlen's intentional overestimation of Soviet military capabilities and intentions played no small part in the spread and enduring intensity of the early Cold War. Gehlen deliberately influenced post-war American military and geopolitical policy by overestimations. In other words, the deliberate overestimation and disinformation by Gehlen's organization of Soviet military and economic preparedness for war helped fuel the Cold War.
Reinhard Gehlen, 1943. It does make sense in the light of a presumptive post-war Nazi intention to exacerbate post-war East-West tensions in order to play one side off against the other, enhancing Germany's position in the process, and exploiting conflicts in other nations that such tensions would inevitably create. And exactly that was the case in respect to the days immediately following Nasser's CIA-sponsored coup. For suddenly, America's interests seemed to fall off Nasser's radar screen, only to be replaced by someone else's. Not long after the war, many German military officers and Nazi Party officials were granted sanctuary in Middle Eastern countries, most notable Egypt and Syria, where they helped develop the militaries and intelligence agencies of those countries. One of these officers who found sanctuary in Egypt was the unrepentantly Nazi general Otto Remer. Remer's presence is significant, for not only was he the founder of the thinly disguised neo-Nazi Socialist Reich Party in post-war West Germany, he was also the very general who crushed the coup attempt against Adolf Hitler in July of 1944 by maintaining Nazi control over the military units in Berlin. It was with General Remer's help, and that of former SS Commando Otto Skorzeny, that Nasser developed an Egyptian support base for anti-Western guerrillas in Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, as well as for insurgencies in Aden and Kenya. Otto Ernst Remer in 1945 left. Skorzeny in 1943, right?
The post-war policy and agenda of the Nazi International was, in other words, the exploitation of anti-imperialist and nationalist insurgencies in the colonial empires of France and Britain. General Remer was the contact point between Nasser's Egypt and these guerrillas, for he arranged the trafficking of arms and training, often with former Muslim and German SS veterans, for these guerrilla movements. Skorzeny himself had arrived in Egypt in the early 1950s to lend his military expertise in the training of the Egyptian army and Muslim and other anti-imperialist guerrilla units. There he quickly formed a triumvirate with Nasser and the Grand Mufti in order to further their mutual goals. Not surprisingly, a young Yasser Arafat met the famous SS commando colonel while being trained in unconventional warfare by the SS and developed a friendship that would reportedly last for many years. Skorzeny's principal responsibility was to train thousands of Egyptian commandos in guerrilla and desert warfare. Furthermore, he organized and planned the initial forays of the early Palestinian terrorists into Israel and the Gaza Strip around 1953 to 1954. An Arab Foreign Legion was created, whose nucleus consisted of 400 former Nazi veterans who were recruited by the Arab League agents in Germany. Finally, Skorzeny sought to protect German scientists, technicians, and engineers who were recruited to work on Egypt's special military program. Skorzeny coordinated all this military activity with yet another German military advisor in Nasser's Egypt, SS Lieutenant General Wilhelm Farnbacher. But what were all these German scientists, technicians, and engineers doing in Egypt to begin with? The clue is found in the presence in Egypt of none other than Dr. Wilhelm Voss, who had been sent to Egypt personally by West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer.
Wilhelm Farnbacher. Konrad Adenauer. Wilhelm Voss.
Dr. Voss was the civilian liaison inside the engineering division of the Skoda Munitions Work in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, and it is thanks to Voss's revelations to British journalist Tom Agoston that the existence of SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kamier's secret weapons think tank inside of the Skoda works was first publicly revealed. Voss was in Egypt coordinating the secretive West German technical assistance being given to Nasser to develop his own missiles capable of targeting Israel and other neighbors, but he was also coordinating West Germany's economic assistance and trade with the new Nasser regime. Indeed, his influence in the early years of Nasser's Egypt was so sweeping that he was in fact the architect of the Egyptian economy in the early post-war years. But there's more, for according to George Michael and other researchers, it was Voss who, working with Reinhard Gehlen, Skorzeny, and Hjalmar Schacht, increased West Germany's trade with Egypt. Not only was Schacht present, but a former member of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry was represented in the form of Johann von Leers, a former assistant to Goebbels himself. Once in Egypt, von Leers helped translate Mein Kampf into Arabic. One only need recall Saddam Hussein's copy in this regard, but also other Nazi classics, such as the notorious Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Johann von Leers in 1933. Hjalmar Schacht in 1931. Additionally, von Leers assisted Nasser's regime in churning out an endless stream of torrid anti-Western and anti-Israeli propaganda. The sudden appearance of so many high-ranking and well-connected Nazis in Nasser's Egypt was obviously by deliberate design. The presence of so many people, including Hjalmar Schacht, Reinhard Gehlen, and SS Colonel Skorzeny, in this venture can hardly be accidental. Schacht's activities in the Middle East also bear mentioning as well, for he or his hidden masters hardly restricted their economic vision to Egypt alone, for he was the major broker of the so-called Jeddah Agreement in 1954 between German industrial companies and Saudi Arabia. Under the protocols of this agreement, Saudi Arabia agreed to establish a fleet of supertankers to be built in German shipyards that would transport Saudi oil around the world. And as if that were not enough to convince the most hardened skeptic that all these connections can hardly be coincidental, the Greek magnate Aristotle Onassis was chosen to manage the shipping side of the arrangement.
Wikipedia information.
Aristotle Socrates Onassis, 20th January 1906, 15th March 1975, was a Greek and Argentine business magnate. He amassed the world's largest privately owned shipping fleet and was one of the world's richest and most famous men. On October 20th, 1968, Onassis married Jackie Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated American President John F. Kennedy. Aristoteles Onassis, 1967.
This deal, of course, directly threatened British and American oil interests in the region, for it threatened to end their own cartelization of the commodity and the Middle East's oil field. With the aid of the CIA, they succeeded in blocking the agreement. The very fact that the CIA was involved in this affair is an indicator that it was encountering very serious and blowback in its early backing of the coup that brought Nasser into power in Egypt. The ultimate geopolitical goal for all these above-mentioned maneuvers was to form a third bloc, Shades of Juan Perón. See Nazi International Part 2. During this period, Renaissance Nazis saw the rise of Arab and Third World nationalism as an excellent opportunity to create a German Islamic neutralist alliance that would extend from the heart of Europe to the South China Sea. This idea was consistent with the late Karl Haushofer's policy of an alliance with the colored world. Karl Haushofer was Adolf Hitler's geopolitical guru and one of the salient influences on Hitler's geopolitical views as expounded in Mein Kampf. Haushofer is generally regarded as responsible for popularizing geopolitics. One vision of this new extreme right foreign policy was to create, with the assistance of the Grand Mufti and the Arab League, a German-Egyptian-dominated power bloc that could resist both the United States and the Soviet Union. This creation of a third bloc between the United States and Communist Russia was one of the major post-war goals of the Nazi International. For that bloc would inevitably have to be centered on Europe and on Germany's position as the still predominant European power. Needless to say, not all went according to the post-war Nazi plans for Egypt either, for under increasing pressure from the Soviet Union, Nasser went out of his way to alienate his West German allies by recognizing the government of East Germany. In response, West Germany retaliated by breaking relations with Egypt and withdrawing its technical and economic support. But even in these events, one discern a palpable Nazi influence at work. The presence of General Reinhard Gehlen's espionage network inside of Eastern Europe implies the possibility that this organization, the only intelligence organization with known connections both to the Eastern and Western blocs, have played a role in the secret coordination of Russian and American space activities. But to put it in this political context gives that possibility more significance, for as German foreign policy has consistently and historically played East and West off against each other, the post-war Nazi International, if it was to pursue a similar course of action, would have to have a presence in both blocs. Understandably then, some post-war Nazis promoted closer cooperation with the Eastern Bloc. One of these was an old friend and associate of Otto Skorzeny, himself a proponent of westward orientation, Dr. Fritz Grobba, who was Berlin's ambassador to Iraq and to Saudi Arabia prior to the Nazi-supported coup that overthrew the British puppet government in Baghdad. Indeed, he and the Grand Mufti had both collaborated in this design. But after the war, this former Nazi Middle Eastern ambassador and convert to Islam wound up as the director of Arab affairs at the Soviet Foreign Ministry in Moscow, and thus was the Soviet point man in brokering the first arms deal between the Soviet Union and Nasser's Egypt. Not only that, there is also evidence that at the same time that as Skorzeny acted as the liaison between the Nazi International, the Adenauer government in Bonn, and Egypt also thought to have helped Nasser's alliance with the Soviet Union.
Fritz Grobba left, talking to al-Husseini.
To put it as succinctly as possible, Nazis were behind the overthrow of King Farouk and the installation of Nasser. Nazis were behind the training of his intelligence agency and army. Nazis not only helped guide Egypt's economy, but they were also behind Nasser's alliance with the Soviet Union. Nor was this without immediate economic and geopolitical repercussions, for as is now known, with his Nazi-trained troops, Soviet weapons, and Nazi-manipulated new alliance with Moscow, Nasser seized the Suez Canal and successfully expelled the last vestiges of French and British power and influence in Egypt. It is perhaps significant, then, that Nasser eventually expelled the Soviets from Egypt, for if there was a hidden Nazi hand in the initial invitation, there may have been one in the expulsion as well. An international terrorists summit. In addition to direct post-war machinations in the various Middle Eastern nations, there was also an attempt to penetrate and coordinate post-war international terrorist activity as well. The Black International, which operated under the name of the European New Order, held a summit at Barcelona on behalf of the Palestinians. The organization was composed of various Nazis and fascists from Nazi Germany, Vichy France, Franco's Spain, Salazar's Portugal, Mussolini's Italy, and the Greek colonel's military junta. The Spanish leader, General Francesco Sich, Franco, is believed to have endorsed the meeting. 2 representatives from Fatah, the military arm of the PLO, attended the event. Reportedly, the delegates discussed raising money, organizing the arms traffic, and providing ex-Nazi military instructors to help train guerrillas. A major endeavor was to recruit Caucasians to augment Fatah's forces in the Middle East and also collaborate in acts of sabotage and terrorism in Europe. Several summits followed this event, including one held on September 16, 1972, barely 10 days after Palestinian Black September terrorists killed 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics.
The September 18, 1972 cover of Time.
In other words, the now familiar pattern of internationalizing Nazism around a solidly German core was again in evidence, in a deliberate effort to coordinate European and Middle Eastern terrorist activity. These efforts knew no bounds. As is now known, many members of Licio Gelli's notorious P2G Masonic Lodge in Italy in the 1960s and 1970s had fascist and Nazi connections, and Gelli himself, in a less than coincidental and ironic parallel to the post-war Nazi ratlines, fled Italy to avoid prosecution. He went, of course, to Argentina. And one of the most notorious of these post-war terrorists, affiliated with a Nazi-sponsored secret society, was Mehmet Ali Agca, the assassin who attempted to murder Pope John Paul II in cold blood during a papal appearance at the Vatican shortly into the latter's pontificate. Agca was a member of a Turkish secret society called the Grey Wolves, a society founded by a former Turkish SS member and volunteer, Mehmet Kengeli.
Licio Gelli. P2 Masonic Lodge Ritual. P2 Masonic Lodge Emblem.
Roberto Calvi and the P2 Connection Wikipedia information.
The Propaganda du P2 organization was originally an Italian Masonic lodge that was misappropriated in the 1970s to disguise a secret political organization. In 1981, during an investigation of P2's activities, it became known that a conspiratorial network of police, military, business, political, mafia, and intelligence leaders had been created with the significant participation of Licio Gelli. Mafia and Secret Services. There was a serious suspicion that the secret society had developed plans for a coup d'etat and was linked to false flag terrorist attacks staged in the 1970s, which was later confirmed in judicial investigations. P2 was disbanded and banned in 1982, P3 was disbanded by authorities in 2010. The Propaganda Quattro Group, or P4, formed after the dissolution of P3, is headed by Gelli's lodge brother Luigi Bisignani. Its members are accused of betraying the results of an investigation, extortion, favoritism, and abuse of office. https://n. Wikipedia. Org, Wiki. Propaganda. Do.
Wikipedia information.
Roberto Calvi, 13th April 1920, 17th June 1982, was an Italian banker, dubbed God's banker, by the press because of his close business dealings with the Holy See. He was a native of Milan and was chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, which collapsed in one of Italy's biggest political scandals. Calvi's death by hanging in London in June 1982 is a source of enduring controversy and was ruled a murder after 2 coroner's inquests and an independent investigation. 5 people were acquitted in Rome in June 2007 of conspiracy to murder Roberto Calvi. Popular suspicion has linked allegedly corrupt officials of the Vatican Bank, the Sicilian Mafia, and the Continental Freemasonry Lodge propaganda due to his death. https://zim. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Roberto Calvi.
172nd Contact Sunday, 4th of July 1982, 11:03 HRs.
I have one more question. On the 18th of June, Roberto Calvi, the head of Italy's largest private bank, was discovered in London hanging from a bridge. Did he commit suicide? Do you know anything about this?
I am oriented over it. The man did not commit suicide, but he was strangled, and this was in connection with a very intricate matter in which the Vatican and the secret services, and also secret lodges, played important roles. But about this, I want to tell you the following in confidence, which you must keep to yourself for the next 20 years.
Roberto Calvi.
Nazi-sponsored, Mehmet Ali Agca Wikipedia information. Assassination attempt on the Pope.
Agca carried out the assassination attempt on John Paul II in St. Peter's Square in Rome on May 13, 1981, using a pistol. 3 bullets hit the Pope, one of them seriously wounding him, while 2 bullets shattered his left index finger and grazed his right forearm. The 3rd bullet destroyed several loops of small intestine and eventually exited just beside his spine. Agca attempted to flee after the shooting, but was confronted by papal bodyguard Camillo Sibin and was arrested.
Reaction of Pope John Paul II.
The Pope caused a stir when he forgave the assassin while he was still on his sickbed in the Gemelli Clinic and visited him in prison 2 years after his recovery. Since the assassination fell on the 64th anniversary of the first Marian apparition at Fatima, John Paul II attributed his salvation to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and later thanked her with a pilgrimage to Fatima. Agca linked the assassination to Fatima at a court hearing in 1985 and referred to himself as Christ Reborn.
Pardon in Italy.
After being sentenced to life imprisonment in July 1981, he was pardoned on June 13, 2000, after 19 years in prison. Italian President Ciampi pardoned him at the request of the Pope, and Agca was extradited to Turkey. Mehmet Ali Agca and Pope Johannes Paul II. Emblem of the Turkish Secret Society, the Grey Wolves.
th Contact, Thursday, 21st April 2005, 22:35 HRs.
This article here. It's about the assassination of Pope John Paul II by Ali Agca.
Ta reads the short article.
Yes, that is true. Akka had, among other things, also Vatican insider help. But I am not allowed to give more information about that.
182nd contact. Thursday, 3rd February, 1983, 22:31 HRs.
Do you still remember the assassination attempt on the Pope?
How could I not?
Very well indeed. It was just a question because the consequences will continue for a long time.
You mean that the relevant things are not concluded yet and that even further impacts will arise from this?
That is correct, because in the middle of the year 1983, further consequences will arise in this connection. The assassin is to be set free as a result of extortionate kidnapping. Therefore, a younger girl will be kidnapped, so that the Italian government will be forced by extortion to release the murderer and assassin Ali Agca.
Nor were Turkey, Egypt, Palestine, and Iraq the only centers of pre- and post-war Nazi attention. Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, widely regarded during the 1970s and 1980s as a premier state sponsor of international terrorism, also had its own role. While there is no known direct connection between Gaddafi and post-war neo-Nazism, it is peculiar that Gaddafi, who attempted to orchestrate his own international terrorist organization, did so in conjunction with his elaboration of a foreign policy that attempted to combine into a broad coalition nations and groups seeking an alternative to the Western and Eastern blocs. Essentially, Gaddafi, who outlined his ideas in a treatise called The Green Book, attempted to combine nationalism, anti-capitalism, anti-communism, and anti-imperialism into a populist ideology. He called his idea third position Zim. As indicated before, this third position was a major theme in the designs of the post-war Nazi International. And that very position itself is the indication of a hidden, though very real, German guiding hand on the international geopolitical stage in the post-war world.
Source: Nazi International, The Nazis' Post-War Plan to Control Finance, Conflict, Physics, and Space, by author Joseph P. Farrell, published in 2009.
Guest author